Wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we're up to. We're Enigma. We're a data technology company here in New York. As Matt mentioned, we recently fundraised just shy of $100 million. And we're tackling a pretty hard problem. The ugly reality that I like to say to a bunch of data-driven optimists in the room is I still don't believe that businesses have done much in terms of putting data to work. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago that was focused on helping banks. How can banks externalize their data and create services and open up their banking data to a whole bunch of entrepreneurs? And my first comment was, it'd be great if the banks knew how to share their data in between each other within their divisions, right? There's a whole lot of work to do to get there. And when we started the company, one of the founding premises was really that we fail to connect the dots when it comes to data. And we thought a lot about the financial crisis and how just these very fundamental things, like the fact that people's home ownership and unemployment were skyrocketing together in the financial crisis, and that all of the bankers that were trading mortgage-backed securities were looking at default rates, whereas they could be looking at the very underlying principles, just failing to connect those dots. And we found out that one of the most underleveraged assets was core public data generated by governments across the world, open data, data that was easy to get from a kind of bootstrapping the company perspective, i.e. we could go out and get it ourselves. We didn't have to have expensive licensing agreements or shell out a lot of cash. And we set out, and what we did was collected one of the broadest repositories of public data on the market. And we've been, I think TechCrunch Disrupt was 2013. That's what we kind of unveiled there. And the goal was to find, what are the ways in which we can put this data to work? And since then, we've had quite an interesting journey discovering what exactly that is, right? And what are the challenges to actually doing it, right? There's a lot of, kind of supply chain process in terms of taking the data and transforming it into something highly valuable. We learned, of course, that half of the equation is not just about our data, but about the customer data and how the customer data needs to be transformed in such a way that you can actually take decisions on it. And what we started building out over the course of the years is essentially a representation of the data that looks much different than the one that we started out with. Whereas we had exposed hundreds of thousands of data sets and told people, go at it, the reality of the matter was that we had to connect the dots in the data ourselves, and we had to merge the data together to make it into one data model, into one knowledge graph of sorts that did very fundamental things that allowed people to actually put the data to work, like resolve the entities, make sure that we could compare different data sets together. I mean, we had data on, let's say even all companies in the United States, corporate registration records. Let's say you're interested in underwriting to restaurants and you wanted to take a look at liquor licenses. Well, there's 50 different states worth of liquor licenses. There's, I'd say, upwards of 300 different code categories if you wanted to do a comparison as to who's allowed to sell, wine and beer and who's allowed to sell hard liquor. Just the sheer volume of mapping became quite difficult to handle in just a more traditional data content format, and we had to build out essentially this mechanism to model the data in a new way. And the underlying learning for us, kind of biggest learning that the company embarked as we started to merge all of our data together and we started to actually dig deep into our client data, was that there was this little myth about the data industry that most people were in, and that we were in a different kind of way. The myth was that data was changing the world and it was so easy to use, and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world productize the crap out of this, and they're going to eat your lunch because they're so good at data. But the reality of the matter is that most of the successes you hear about in the data space, enterprise or not, the data that they deal with is instrumented in bits. i.e. the data that they're collecting comes from a machine, most often user activity generated on the internet. And the experiences or the value that they're creating is really value that is also rendered in bits, i.e. recommendations for e-commerce, advertising, search, but that there's this whole swath of quote-unquote real-world data and real-world use cases, like routing firemen to the right place to inspect, or providing a credit card a credit card loan to someone that was leagues behind in the amount of data that was being used to make these decisions, and the swiftness with which these teams were operationalizing data, and how much technology they were actually able to put to work. And the reason for that is that it's really freaking hard to deal with real-world data. It has a completely different characteristic. When you're trying to resolve an identity of someone online, you can approximate it. Like, yeah, we've seen this device. This person kind of goes here. We've seen this cookie floating around. Okay. Yeah, we can serve that ad with a probabilistic confidence. But when you're, a bank issuing a credit card, screening against a sanctions list of known terrorists and financial criminals in dozens of languages with phonetic spellings and real-world spellings, and all you have is a set of names from the US government, you put a couple thousand people to work making sure manually that this data set is being resolved, right? And that's the reality that we deal with in the world of atoms, that data is inconsistent. There are no real keys. There's even philosophical differences as to what the objects are. Like, what is a company if it dissolves and the same people kind of reopen it? Is it the same company? Is it a franchise? There are actual philosophical questions that you have to ask about what these entities are. If a person, I don't know, does something like changes their whole identity, are you going to go classify them the same as you would have before? There are no knowledge graphs in the world. Approaches to solving this problem that actually what they do is embed metadata in the data structure, right? That's the key component of a knowledge graph. There's two key components. One is the ability to embed metadata in the data structure itself, i.e. the attributes are known. So if you're talking about a person, they kind of always look away. A company, they always kind of look away. And that helps you model richer structure that lets you deal with real-world entities. The other is obviously things like graph traversal, being able to run queries that are very sophisticated and allow you to analyze networks of how people are related to each other. Google's knowledge graph, probably the one you use the most. Very helpful if you're trying to figure out, what are the last 5 Matt Damon movies or something along those lines. Awesome. I quite love the Google Knowledge Graph for the ease that it's brought to our day-to-day experience. But we've had to deal with some hairier use cases. Today, we're focusing a lot on small and medium businesses. There are about 30 million of them in the United States. Quite difficult to get a resolution of them all. If I asked you to come meet me at Joe's Pizza in New York City, there's probably 9 different places you could show up that would, get an angry text message. Where are you? I'm at Joe's Pizza. I'm also at Joe's Pizza. Right? There's a lot of problems we have to deal with. None of their addresses in their corporate registrations are actually the addresses that the locations are in. So we've had to build quite a process and a pipeline around this that goes from data acquisition to actually mapping the ontology, i.e. the definition of our data model, to enriching the data, resolving it, and putting this out in the graph database and API. This required a lot of tooling. We've spoken here a lot before about our tooling. For a while, we were actually, making some good money selling this to folks in market. Definitely an important thing to productize, how you ingest data, get that down right, because it will bite you eventually if you don't. But the biggest kind of step function for us was moving away from data sets to entities and thinking strictly in a view that's entity-centric. Having the ontology as the blueprint for how we deliver data products. And that means building tools that help manage ontologies, help manage conflicts, help manage the transformation in between the relationships in your data sets to the relationships to your master knowledge graph, of which we've done a lot at Enigma. Entity resolution begs the problem of, how do I know that these two things are the same? Or is this the right, Matt Turck, right? Depending on having very, very, very disparate records and making sure that those records refer to the same person. My name is quite hard to spell and quite hard to pronounce. Not a lot of entity resolution when it comes to Hicham Oudghiri in the United States, but you would be surprised, there are a couple, right? And folks in this industry who know this problem well are amazing. You talk to folks at major banks who deal with these problems when it comes to, pulling anything from credit scores to, liens that you may be on. They know exactly, like off the top of their head, the statistics of the most common names, almost as a parlor trick in the industry. We've used a lot of machine learning to solve these kinds of problems. The computer is just much more sophisticated at understanding what attributes in your data model are most conducive to making a decision, giving you a probabilistic inference that you're merging the two right data points into one entity. And then, obviously, being able to power this and serve this up in such a way that your client data can now be linked to it. Actually solving a matching problem and an output problem. How do you output a graph, right? A graph is mostly a mathematical representation. Graph databases are not quite where they are yet. So outputting this either as an API, and so that you can provide a matching service to your clients, or outputting this on-prem. It's a different database format, and finding how to match on the back end. So that's been mostly the challenge that we've been going on at Enigma. We like this mantra of telling people the data lake journey basically just moves all of your stuff into one place. But if you really want to get a view of how your data is connected, you really need to think about making things much more about, representing them in a much more entity-specific way. And this has helped us, and I'd say some of the hardest and most mission-critical use cases to crack, everything from anti-money laundering to advanced marketing use cases, KYC, underwriting use cases for banks, insurance, property and casualty, which we play in today. The Enigma company graph is probably the one folks are familiar with the most at this point, which contains 30 million different SMBs worth of data and over 1,000 attributes that we've been sourcing from public data, deriving. I mean, the funny thing is that once you get the entity resolution problem right, and you're like, hey, this is the right company, and I have 17 different records pointing to it, and I've been able to, despite the problems in the addresses and the names, match to it, you get these super hairy problems of, well, what industry is this company in? Well, I have 7 different places this company has marked that NICS code or industry classification code. Which one is best? Which source do I trust? Which sources are more canonical than others? How can I provision that programmatically? Fun problems that make, again, for the statement that the real world is much, much hairier than what's instrumented in bits. We think this can support tons of use cases, which is why we're very excited about what we do. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the data business that we're in, I think what inspires and motivates us the most is we get to link all of this data together to actually generate some insight. What we learn from our data is probably the most valuable thing and the thing that gets us, kind of motivated to do the crazy stuff that every entrepreneur does. Really applaud the last speaker on his story. That was fun, to say the least. So that's what we have for you today. Thanks for having us again.
Thank you very much. So maybe a quick update on the business side of things since you were here last, which was, what, a couple of years ago?
Yes.
Yes. Who do you Who do you sell to? Who are your big customers?
So our biggest market is definitely financial services, followed by, within the financial services, insurance. In the financial services industry, it's definitely going to be risk management in general. A whole swath of use cases across risk management. BlackRock is a big customer. PayPal is a big customer. American Express is a big customer. BB&T is a big customer. They've all, there's this phase that you go through as a startup where you feel like your clients are embarrassed by you and they don't want to talk about you. And then there's this fun little phase where they start to show up to the party and you're like, okay, great, people are showing up. So people are showing up to our party and starting to talk about us in a fun way.
And where do you sit in their workflow? So they collect the data and then you sort of match their data with your data?
Yeah, the most canonical use case for us is basically delivering some sort of insight for some sort of repeated decision. Generally that involves bringing a whole swath of our data, a whole swath of their data together, linking that data. Some piece of analytics will be done to serve the actual use case, right? If this is credit card underwriting, what you have in underwriting is actually, a prospecting phase, an onboarding phase, a verification phase, a monitoring phase, and different attributes will be used for different parts of that. We're getting much more feedback and experience from our customers in understanding what those attributes are and which have lift on their models, which allows us to actually push more of a decision to customers than just a data product. So that's been very useful. I think that's probably the biggest shift that's happened in our business is, we were valuable for our data, then we became valuable for our ability to link and match it to theirs and give them this ability to model things into a graph. And now we're valuable in the decision space too. It's been, I'd say, really a journey built on the back of a lot of, no pun intended, deep learning from clients.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And just on the sort of entrepreneurial conversation, is it fair to say that it's one of those stories where you turn over a card and then you learn that something works and then that leads you to the next card? Is like, oh, maybe I should turn this one.
For sure. Yeah, I feel like it's been kind of a big game of like Texas Hold'em. Like the first one is like, ooh, my hand is interesting. The second one is, when my co-founder and I started this company, we had a lot of passion for the problem, which was this kind of data, this character of data that's much more a model of how the real world operates. That's the problem we wanted to solve. We think it's a semantic problem fundamentally. That's always been at the heart of what we do. It's been very hard to kind of iterate our way into how to make money from that. But, we have this New York City attitude about it. So we have this big San Francisco semantic, let's change the world, how does data actually speak to itself vision, and New York approach of how do we get the most value out of how we know to serve, what we know will change the needle for a client or provide massive lift in their model, and we like balancing those approaches a lot.
And just quickly going back to that workflow question, so I understand you do the entity resolution, the machine learning and all the things, but just going back to the data collection, which is, I guess,
Yes.
where you guys started from, just that is an immensely complicated problem, right? Like, especially for small businesses, the hairdresser
Super complicated.
goes out of business.
Yeah.
How do you keep it current?
So that's been an interesting scale issue for us. The first thing we did was, that was actually, sorry, I'll say it better. That was literally the first thing that we did. My co-founder and I started parsing a bunch of data, hired a lot of people to parse a bunch of data, really felt like having it was important, hoarding it was important. Then we concentrated on tooling to give us an advantage in our approach to that. I think at this point, our hunger for data has far outgrown that. we're much more interested in partnering with folks who have data, thinking about wholesale, starting data ingestion operations in partnership with other folks. I've talked to hedge funds about that, for instance, with some mixed success, but definitely some success indeed. So our data gathering operation at its core is still there, but we have many, many different alternative means of growing that set now, given that the main competency has definitely moved from that to actually resolving it.
Great. All right, I want to open up to questions. We have some over there.
I come from a city planning background, and not recently and not my current job, I use many of those public data sets you had up on the board. And back then, there were a lot of rules and a lot of political pressure around disclosure, like data on an industry in a particular county had to be suppressed if there wasn't enough, so you could figure out one firm, there could be more than two. It was secondary suppression, all different places if they were part of a bigger geography. And I'm wondering, is that all gone? Any business is happy to have its information available?
That's a very interesting question. So, listen, there's a reason why data exists publicly. Some data exists publicly, and it's mainly to create trust in the economic system. Like if I'm buying a house from someone, I want to be able to verify independently that that person indeed owns the house. Or if I wanted to enter into business with someone, I'd like to know a modicum of facts about them, i.e., when did they register this company? Is this company actually registered? And the trend has definitely been to open up more and more and more and more data. I think what we've been seeing for the first time in the last 5 years is all of these issues around data privacy, specifically around individuals. We haven't noticed any changes in the data in and of itself. Like if you want a data set on almost every single citizen in the United States that's fully public, voter registration records, right? 300 million people's worth of, their phone number, addresses, what party they're affiliated to, variety of things that are, deemed important enough to be public record. But people haven't really kind of gone beyond that in their sentiment against opening up things. If anything, the rules that you're speaking to are definitely still there and going to get tighter, which I think is a good thing, to be honest. I think there's a lot of ways for this data to be, used for the wrong reasons. A lot of these data sets are open with small restrictions saying, like, you can't use this for marketing or soliciting, and people still do. We find that to be quite annoying.
We have one back here. Hey, very interesting talk. I had one question. How generalizable is kind of like the validation method of this entity resolution? Like I was thinking about two use cases you mentioned in your talk. So you have like maybe something like your customer AML where like an extra token like Mr. or Mrs. in front of a name is not an issue. But if you're looking for something like reviews of like a bank, you get Chase Bank ATM that has no reviews, but if you have Chase Bank that does. How does this kind of like generalize to new types of use cases for entity resolution?
So it's definitely not generalizable, which is, part and parcel of our IP, right? Being able to resolve companies and specifically small and medium businesses really well is different than being able to resolve people and being able to resolve, products like supply chain products. I was talking to one of the biggest one of the biggest suppliers to the kind of restaurant industry, and they have problems with billing, billing codes for different products like packets of ketchup. It's a deep rabbit hole that you go down, and you need to kind of go down it one by one. But the use cases that emerge from resolving classes and categories of them are quite repeatable. I'd say most of our IP is actually the algorithms that resolve known domain classes of entities.
All right. On this note, thank you so much, Hicham. It's terrific.
All right. Thank you.